In the shimmering heart of Manhattan, where towering glass buildings scratch the clouds and money moved faster than emotion, Blake Whitmore reigned like a king, a young billionaire whose name was synonymous with success, scandal, and seduction. With ocean blue eyes that could freeze time and a voice that danced somewhere between silk and thunder, Blake never knew resistance, never faced hesitation, never once heard the word no from a woman. That was until Savannah Hart entered his world, not through a red carpet or gala, but through a splash of hot coffee and a startled apology on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She was working the closing shift at Cafe Marlowe, hair tied back, apron wrinkled, eyes alert yet exhausted from juggling textbooks and bills. She wasn't the kind of woman who wore labels. She wore purpose. Blake noticed her the second he stepped in. While others faded into the hum of jazz and steam, she glowed with a light untouched by wealth or power. There was something defiant in the way she carried herself. Not arrogant, but rooted, like she knew exactly who she was and had no intention of being swept away by a pretty face with a padded wallet. When Blake accidentally spilled his espresso across the counter and she looked up at him with calm disdain instead of admiration, he felt something stir, not lust, but curiosity. Their conversation was clumsy, laced with unexpected sarcasm and quiet revelations. She had dreams bigger than the cafe, ambitions inked in the margins of her journal, and a heart armored by heartbreaks she didn't bother explaining. Blake, used to conquering boardrooms and bedrooms alike, found himself stripped of his usual confidence. There was no flirtatious giggle, no stolen glance, just honest dialogue and the kind of silences that ask questions without words. He found himself wanting to make her smile, not for ego, but for peace. When the rain intensified and the lights flickered, they stood alone by the window, the world outside misted with silver drizzle. It felt like a scene from a movie he never thought he'd live. Acting on instinct, fueled by the sudden intimacy of shared stories and her close presence, Blake leaned in. His breath was steady, his heart oddly unsure, lips just inches from hers. But she turned her head, not harshly, but with gentle firmness, as if she were shielding both of them from a mistake. Her voice was calm, not cold. "I'm not one of your socialite flings," she said, eyes meeting his with a kind of sad strength that spoke of past disappointments and present clarity. Then she stepped back, picked up her tray, and walked away, leaving behind only the echo of her boots on the tiled floor and the faint scent of cinnamon and rain. For a moment, Blake just stood there, unsure whether to feel embarrassed or awakened. No woman had ever rejected him before. Not like this. Not with such grace, such quiet finality. And instead of bruising his pride, it ignited something deeper. As he stepped into the stormy street, rain soaking his tailored coat, he realized he didn't even know her last name. But her first name, Savannah, now lived in the corners of his mind like a whisper he couldn't silence. She hadn't just refused his kiss. She had shattered the illusion that he could buy love with charm and luxury. For the first time in years, Blake wasn't chasing a conquest. He was chasing a question. Who was Savannah Hart, really? And why did her rejection feel more intimate than all the kisses he'd ever stolen? Blake's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one swirling relentlessly around the memory of Savannah. The woman who had so effortlessly refused him not once but twice, yet had somehow lodged herself deep within his heart and soul. Unlike the countless women he had encountered in his privileged world, dazzled by his wealth and status, Savannah was a mystery wrapped in strength and vulnerability, a combination so rare it left him both breathless and utterly captivated. Determined not to lose her, Blake found himself returning to the modest cafe not with ostentatious gifts or rehearsed lines, but with a genuine desire to connect, to understand the woman behind those clear, determined eyes. As days melted into weeks, their conversations grew richer, revealing hidden depths of character and experience. Savannah spoke freely about her dreams, dreams that had been nurtured quietly during late nights spent studying literature at the local community college, all while balancing the exhausting demands of her waitressing job. She confided in Blake the tragedy that had shaped her resilience, the painful loss of her father, A man whose honor and reputation had been torn apart in a ruthless corporate scandal, leaving her family adrift in a sea of uncertainty and hardship. But even as she recounted the sorrow, there was a spark in her voice, a fierce determination to rise above her circumstances, to build a life defined by her own terms, rather than the mistakes or misfortunes of others. Blake found himself drawn not to her outer beauty, though that was undeniable, but to this fire, this unyielding spirit that burned quietly within her. The allure of Savannah's character eclipsed the fleeting charms of his usual conquests, awakening something in him that he had never felt before, a longing for genuine connection, for a love built on trust, honesty, and mutual respect. One cold evening, when a brutal snowstorm had locked the city in its icy grip, fate conspired to trap them together in a nearly deserted subway station. The world outside was a swirling chaos of wind and snow, but within that small, dimly lit space, time seemed to slow, each second charged with electricity and unspoken possibility. Blake wrapped his coat tighter around Savannah's slender shoulders, feeling the warmth of her body against his own, a comfort amidst the biting cold. Their eyes met, and in that gaze there was a silent exchange of emotions: hope, hesitation, yearning, and a deepening trust. As the noise of the storm faded into the background, Blake's heart thundered in his chest as he leaned closer, his breath mingling with hers in the crisp air. When their lips finally met, it was a kiss unlike any he had ever given or received, tentative, respectful, full of questions rather than demands. This was not the aggressive claim of a man accustomed to having his way, but a vulnerable invitation, a plea to be allowed into her world. Savannah's reaction was gentle yet firm. She did not pull away with anger or disgust, nor did she push him closer with eagerness. Instead, she placed a soft hand on his chest, steadying both of them. Her breath was shaky, eyes shining with an intense mixture of emotions, as she whispered with a voice trembling yet resolute, "Don't ruin what's growing between us." Those words struck Blake profoundly, not as a rejection, but as a plea to nurture the fragile connection they were forging, to honor the slow and delicate process of building trust. He felt a surge of admiration and protectiveness, understanding that this was not a game to be won, but a relationship to be cherished and cultivated with patience and care. As the storm raged on outside, the city seeming to hold its breath along with them, Blake and Savannah sat side by side on the cold bench, wrapped in the cocoon of shared vulnerability and unspoken promises. In that moment, Blake vowed silently to respect her boundaries, to treasure the growing bond between them, and to prove that he was worthy of the love she cautiously offered. For the first time in his life, he was willing to wait, to truly see the woman behind the guarded smile, and to let their story unfold naturally without force or rush. The storm, which had once seemed so menacing, became a symbol of their connection, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, warmth and light could be found. As the snow continued to fall, and the world outside remained frozen, a quiet flame of hope ignited between them, fragile yet unbreakable, signaling the beginning of a love that neither Blake nor Savannah could deny any longer. It was a love that promised to be tested by challenges in time, but also one that held the power to heal wounds, shatter barriers, and transform two very different lives into one intertwined future. And so, in the cold stillness of that stormy night, surrounded by the noise of the city muffled by snow, two hearts beat with cautious hope, ready to face whatever the future might bring together. Blake stood silently under the golden flickering lights of the Brooklyn Bridge, the night air crisp yet heavy with unspoken tension. Around them the city hummed quietly, but in that moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them, caught in a fragile pause where everything felt raw and uncertain. Savannah's presence beside him was unlike anything he'd ever known. There was a guarded strength about her, a layer of defenses that only deepened the intrigue burning in his chest. Over countless days and nights, he had come to realize that her resistance to him wasn't born out of mere pride or stubbornness, but was rooted in a history far darker and more complex than he had ever imagined. Savannah had been deeply wounded by a past betrayal so profound, it shaped the very way she viewed love and trust. Years ago, she had been naive enough to believe in the man she dated, a man who wore the mask of devotion but hid a sinister secret beneath. That man had used her like a pawn, manipulating her affections to gain access to private documents that could destroy her father's business empire. The betrayal was more than personal. It was a calculated act that shattered her family's legacy and left her questioning everything about loyalty, love, and who she could truly trust. Savannah's sarcastic smiles and witty retorts had long been her armor, shields designed to keep others at a distance and hide the pain lurking beneath. Blake felt a pang of sorrow for the wall she had built, but he also saw the flicker of something else, a desperate hope that someone might still see her, truly see her, beyond the hurt and the scars. Blake himself was no stranger to power and control, but the lessons of his own life had taught him that money and influence could not heal broken hearts or undo the damage of the past. For once he was faced with something he couldn't simply buy or command, the fragile heart of a woman who had learned to protect herself by shutting others out. The puzzle of Savannah was unlike anything he had encountered before, and with each passing day, his admiration for her soul deepened. He was drawn not just to her beauty, but to the fierce courage she displayed in living through her pain and still daring to dream of something better. And so, on this evening, under the towering arches of the Brooklyn Bridge, Blake summoned the courage to lay bare his feelings. Not just a longing for a kiss or a fleeting moment of closeness, but a profound desire to be part of her life in a way that honored all she was and all she had endured. His voice was steady but filled with emotion as he confessed that he wanted more than just her lips. He wanted her loyalty, her pain, her heart, the entire fragile, complicated woman before him. As he reached out, hoping to close the distance, Savannah's eyes glistened with tears, and the wall she had so carefully constructed trembled. Instead of welcoming his touch, she gently pulled away, her voice breaking as she whispered, "You deserve someone who's whole." "I'm not." Those words struck Blake like a sudden cold wind, yet beneath the sting was a raw honesty that only made him want her more. He saw the vulnerability she tried so hard to conceal and understood that her rejection was not a denial of him, but a fear of her own brokenness. In her heart, she believed she was too damaged to give or receive the kind of love he offered, convinced that her scars made her unworthy. The moment hung heavy between them, charged with the ache of unspoken fears and hopes. Blake felt a surge of protectiveness and tenderness, promising himself silently that he would never push her beyond her limits or rush the healing she needed. Instead, he would be patient, steadfast, and gentle, proving with every action that her past would not define their future. The lights of the bridge flickered above them, casting long shadows that danced like the ghosts of memories past, while the distant sounds of the city's nightlife pulsed like a heartbeat echoing their own. Blake reached out once more, brushing a stray tear from Savannah's cheek, and in that quiet gesture, they shared a fragile moment of trust. He understood that to truly reach her, he would need to unravel the layers of pain and mistrust piece by piece, never losing sight of the woman behind the defenses. Savannah looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with tears and something new, a fragile glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could let him in. The night stretched on, filled with the unspoken promise that this was only the beginning of a journey neither of them could fully predict. But Blake was ready to walk it, hand in hand, heart open, willing to face whatever challenges lay ahead to prove that love could heal even the deepest wounds. Beneath the Brooklyn Bridge, amidst the cold glow of city lights and the quiet hum of a world rushing by, two souls stood on the precipice of something powerful and uncertain. A love story not defined by wealth or status, but by courage, resilience, and the willingness to trust again. The path ahead would be long and filled with trials, but Blake's heart was resolute. He would fight for Savannah's trust, honor her pain, and cherish the woman who had taught him that true connection could not be bought. It had to be earned, slowly and sincerely. In that sacred night, with tears and hopes entwined, Blake and Savannah began to write the first page of a new chapter, a story of love forged in the fire of heartbreak, yet strong enough to promise a future brighter than either had dared to imagine. Blake stood in silence, stunned by the quiet devastation in Savannah's voice. But before he could offer comfort, the storm hit, vicious and loud. The next morning, headlines screamed across gossip blogs and business tabloids. Waitress with a shady past sinks claws into billionaire Blake Whitmore. The photo attached was an old grainy image of Savannah at her lowest, tear-streaked and trembling outside the courthouse after her father's arrest, gripping a crumpled statement of innocence no one ever read. The media didn't care about truth. They craved scandal, and Savannah was the perfect prey. Rumors spread like poison. Claims that she had dated rich men before, that she played the victim to trap fortunes, that her cafe job was just a front. Customers whispered behind her back. Co-workers avoided her like a plague. And her manager, trembling with fear of bad press, handed her a termination letter without even looking her in the eye. The moment she walked out of that cafe for the last time, the sky wept with her. Savannah felt 16 again, powerless, humiliated, and utterly alone. When Blake heard he was already on his way, his car screeching into the alley behind the cafe, only to find her gone. He scoured the city looking for her, and when he finally found her, sitting in the park by the bench with chipped paint, her arms around her knees, her eyes didn't rise to meet his. "I told you," she whispered hoarsely, her voice raw. "My past doesn't die. It just waits for the moment to bury me again." Blake knelt beside her, every inch of his body aching with the need to protect, to shield her from the world's cruelty. "I don't care what they say," he said gently, but she pulled away. "You will, eventually. When your board members question your choices, when your investors pull out, when the world starts asking why a man like you is wasting time on someone like me." Her lip trembled, but she forced strength into her voice. "You deserve someone clean, someone shiny and unbroken." She stood up, leaving behind a man who had conquered Wall Street, but stood defeated in love. But Blake wasn't the type to give up. The next morning before the sun rose, he made a quiet call to his lawyers and bought the cafe outright. The media wouldn't announce it. It would be kept silent. But he ensured that no other employee would suffer backlash because of Savannah. He also called a discreet contact at NYU and paid off her tuition, ensuring her semester wouldn't be jeopardized. But when he showed up outside her apartment, flowers in hand, ready to tell her everything he'd done, Savannah didn't open the door. Instead, she slid a note through the crack. "Thank you, but I need to stand on my own 2 feet. Don't fix me. Just believe in me." He stood there for what felt like hours, hand clenched around petals that began to wilt in the wind. He had money, power, influence, but none of that could buy her trust. None of it could erase the scars left by a world that had once celebrated her fall. What he didn't know was that inside, Savannah was crumbling. She had read the anonymous donation notice, guessed it was him, and sobbed against her pillow because no one had ever believed in her without conditions. She feared the warmth he brought because she didn't know how to hold it without being burned. Yet something in her heart shifted. A seed had been planted. He hadn't kissed her this time, hadn't tried to win her with charm. He'd just been there, even when she told him not to be. And that quiet presence, that steady refusal to let her drown alone, haunted her more deeply than any scandal could. In the silence of her apartment, she whispered to the night, "Please, don't give up on me, Blake." But she didn't know he was still standing on the other side of the door, forehead pressed to the wood, whispering back, "I never will." Savannah never imagined that truth could feel like a punch to the chest. But when her best friend accidentally mentioned that Blake was the new silent owner of the cafe and the one anonymously paying off her tuition, the ground beneath her seemed to dissolve, leaving behind a whirlpool of guilt, confusion, and an aching tenderness she no longer knew how to hold back. For days, she battled the storm inside her, pacing her apartment, gripping her phone only to toss it away, writing and deleting texts she didn't have the courage to send, because how do you confront a man who gave you the very wings you were afraid to fly with, and did it silently, without expecting anything in return, without ego or demand, just unwavering devotion? So, on a Saturday drenched in the soft glow of dusk, Savannah took a cab across the city, heart thudding louder than the honking horns of traffic, and stood before Blake Whitmore's towering penthouse, her fingers cold and hesitant as she pressed the elevator button, her breath shallow as the floor numbers blinked by like countdowns to a moment that could change everything. And when the door opened, when he stood there in a white shirt with sleeves casually rolled and a mug of half-finished coffee in his hand, his eyes instantly softening into an ocean of concern and warmth, she lost every script she'd rehearsed on the ride over. "Savannah?" he asked gently, as if saying her name too loud would shatter her. And she stood frozen for a moment, unsure if she wanted to cry or scream or throw her arms around him and never let go, because suddenly all the walls she had built felt like paper soaked in rain. "Why?" she managed, barely a whisper, the question breaking through her throat like a wounded bird. "Why would you do all of that and not tell me?" And he didn't rush to answer, didn't pull her into a dramatic embrace like in the novels she secretly loved. Instead, he set the mug down and stepped aside, letting her in with a silence that screamed safety, that wrapped around her like a blanket she hadn't realized she needed. In the soft warmth of his living room, surrounded by shelves filled with books he'd started collecting since she once told him about her favorite authors, he turned to her and said the words that split her world open. "I never wanted to fix you. I just wanted to love you, every broken piece." And in that instant, every dam she'd built inside her burst, her vision blurred with tears, not of pain, but of the overwhelming weight of being seen, understood, and cherished beyond her history, beyond her fears, beyond the labels the world had thrown at her. And slowly, like someone stepping into sunlight after years in the cold, she walked toward him, her hands trembling as they lifted to his face, her fingertips brushing the stubble on his jaw, as if to test whether he was real, whether any man could look at her like that and not want something in return. And when their eyes met, his full of vulnerability, hers glazed with realization, they didn't need any more words. Her lips moved closer, and his breath caught slightly, not in arrogance, but in awe. And then it happened. Her lips pressed against his with a gentleness that silenced the world. A kiss that didn't seek to claim, didn't try to fix, but existed simply to tell a story. Their hearts had been writing quietly for weeks. It wasn't fiery like the movies or frantic like Stolen Moments. It was soft, intentional, full of unspoken truths and trembling hope. A kiss that whispered, "I see you. I believe in you. I choose you." Blake's hands didn't wander, but rested lightly at her waist, as if afraid she'd vanish if he held too tightly. And Savannah, for the first time in years, didn't flinch or pull away or second-guess herself. She leaned in, heart first, allowing herself to melt into the moment that had been waiting patiently behind all her fears. When they finally pulled apart, their foreheads resting together, breaths mingling in the quiet, she smiled through tears and said, "You ruined every reason I had to be afraid." And Blake, smiling that half-crooked, boyish grin she was beginning to adore, whispered back, "Then let me keep ruining them, one kiss at a time." And somewhere deep inside her soul, a locked door creaked open. And for once, she didn't feel broken. She felt found. The softness of their kiss still lingered in the air, a moment suspended in time, when Savannah found the old envelope tucked beneath a stack of returned mail at her apartment door. A yellowed, trembling thing addressed in her father's familiar script. She opened it with shaking hands, not knowing it held the storm that would soon unravel everything she had just begun to believe in. As her eyes scanned the careful handwriting, her heart raced, then sank, deep and violently. Her father's words, written in a prison cell during his final days, bled anguish and betrayal. He had uncovered that Whitmore Holdings, the company Blake now helmed, had once been a silent investor through a shell group that helped orchestrate the hostile takeover that destroyed her father's business and reputation. The irony was cruel, unforgiving. The very man who had begun healing her wounds was also the unknowing heir of the force that had inflicted them. She sat frozen on her apartment floor for hours, letter in hand, a silent scream rising from within. That evening, she walked straight to Blake's penthouse, not with hope this time, but with fire, disbelief, and the ghosts of everything she'd buried. Her voice cracked as she confronted him, the letter pressed hard into his chest. "Your success was built on my father's ruin," she choked out, the tremble in her tone laced with betrayal. Blake paled, his breath stolen. "Savannah, I swear to you." "I had no idea," he whispered, stunned, the weight of her pain crashing into him. I didn't even know those names. It was years before I ever touched the CEO's chair. She didn't respond. Her silence was louder than any scream. Blake scrambled to find answers that wouldn't sound like excuses. That night, he stayed awake going through ancient files, tracing every transaction, uncovering a silent investor group that had fed off destruction and greed long before his time. But excuses didn't matter to Savannah. All she could see was the face of the man she loved now, tangled in the death of her past. The next morning, Blake called an emergency board meeting. He told them he would sell the division tied to the scandal, even if it meant cutting off a third of the company's earnings. My future won't be built on blood, he said firmly. He planned to donate every cent of the sale to victims' families, starting with Savannah's. But none of it would matter if she wasn't there to see it. She had disappeared. No texts, no calls, no trace. It was as if she had dissolved into the city's shadows once more, retreating behind the armor she'd spent years forging. Blake searched, called everyone she knew, visited the cafe, her campus, even the old bookstore, where she once mentioned she'd hide from the world. He sat in that bookstore for hours, watching the door, waiting for a ghost. Nothing. Every second was a punishment, a reminder that love wasn't always stronger than history. Her scent still lingered in his shirts, her voice echoed in his hallway, and the warmth of that fourth kiss haunted his lips. He wondered if it had meant as much to her as it had to him, or if it had already been erased by the truth. He started writing her letters, one every day, each confessing what he was doing to make things right, what he was learning about the company he thought he knew, and what it felt like to live without her. He didn't send them. He just kept them stacked on the windowsill, where the city lights blinked like fading stars. Blake had been powerful all his life, but now he felt powerless in the most important battle of all, the fight to reclaim a love that had slipped through his fingers like sand. He whispered her name to the walls, to the sky, to his own reflection. Savannah. A name that once sounded like poetry now felt like a wound. But deep down, he wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Somewhere out there, she was hurting too. And he could only hope she'd read the truth in his eyes if she ever came back. If. The wind outside the Vermont bookstore carried the scent of falling leaves and distant rain. But inside, time seemed to pause as Savannah looked up from her book signing table, pen frozen mid-autograph, her fingers trembling the moment her eyes locked onto the man who had haunted her dreams, her doubts, and her unfinished pages for over a year. Her lips parted, breath stolen, as if the very sight of him pulled open a door she had bolted shut with every ounce of her fear. You came, she whispered, not just surprised, but unsteady, like a part of her heart she had long buried had suddenly begun to beat again. Blake stood there, his expression raw with the weight of everything he'd carried, every regret, every night spent rereading her books under the low light of lonely penthouse windows, every moment he had imagined this reunion, only to fear it would never come. He stepped forward, not with flowers, not with grand apologies or rehearsed speeches, but with one simple truth. I never stopped coming, Savannah, he said, voice hoarse, cracking under the pressure of 1,000 unsent messages. I never stopped loving you. The crowd behind them, the murmurs of fans, the camera flashes capturing the scene, all of it faded like dust in the wake of something too sacred for spectacle. Savannah rose slowly, her heart slamming against her ribs, because no chapter in her novels had prepared her for this kind of reckoning. The moment where fiction and fate collided and love, bruised and breathless, came crawling back. For a moment she didn't move. She studied him, not the billionaire from headlines, not the man from the past who once unknowingly bore the weight of her father's ruin, but the man who had tried to love her without fixing her, who had let her go when it hurt him most, who had chased her not with power, but with patience. Her voice barely escaped her throat. You read them all? She asked, a whisper lined with disbelief. Blake's hand curled into a fist at his side, as if holding back a year's worth of tears. Every word, every chapter, every heartbreak. She took a step toward him, and then another, until the air between them vanished. Even the one where the girl runs away from love because she thinks she's broken? He nodded. Especially that one. A breath escaped her lips, part laugh, part sob. She stared at his face, the soft blue eyes that never lost their warmth, The stubble on his jawline he didn't bother shaving this morning, the vulnerable curve of his lips waiting, hoping, not assuming. And she saw not a savior, not a solution, but something so much more terrifying and beautiful. A safe place. Slowly, tentatively, she lifted her hand and touched his cheek, as if to confirm this wasn't another daydream spun from loneliness. Blake leaned into her palm, his eyes closing for just a second, as if her touch stitched something inside him back together. "I don't know if I'm whole yet," she murmured, "but I'm tired of pretending that love has to wait for perfection." He swallowed hard. "Then don't wait." With that, Savannah rose on her toes, tilted her face toward his, and kissed him. Not with desperation, not with fire, but with a softness that could shatter mountains. Their lips met like a sigh in the middle of a storm, gentle but weighted with everything they had endured. The fourth kiss had been a promise. This one, this kiss in the middle of a bookstore surrounded by strangers, was a homecoming. Blake's hand slid around her waist, holding her as if the world might try to take her again. But this time, he wouldn't let go. Savannah pressed closer, her fingers tangling in his hair. The pain of the past year bleeding into something warmer, something healing. Around them, phones clicked and whispers stirred, but all she could hear was the sound of his heartbeat echoing her own. For so long, she had written happy endings for fictional women, convinced hers would never come. But here, wrapped in the arms of the man who refused to give up on her, she realized something powerful. Sometimes the hardest love to believe in is the one that waits for you after the storm. She pulled away slightly, her forehead resting against his. "I was so scared you'd hate me for disappearing again." Blake smiled softly, brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "I hated every day you were gone, but never you." Her throat tightened, and her eyes shimmered with unspoken gratitude, with love, with a fragile hope reborn. "So, what now?" she whispered. He looked into her, through her, and said, "Now we stop running. We write a new chapter, together." And as they stood there, surrounded by pages and people and passing time, they both knew this wasn't an ending. It was the start of something fierce, something forgiving, something real. Not a fairy tale, not a fantasy, but a love that had bled, healed, and survived.